Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
We are the Cooper family. My wife Emily is 32, tall, graceful, and confident with an easy smile. Nathan, 36, 6 foot tall. A bit overweight and diabetic, but still attractive to women even at 215 pounds. Despite that, loyal and faithful to Emily. Our son Jake is 10, and we've been married nearly 11 years. Our best friends David and Laura Benson are both 36, and their daughter Samantha is also 10. Samantha has type 1 diabetes, managed with blood glucose monitoring and insulin. David is 64, around 235 pounds. David and I have been friends since 3rd grade when my family moved next door to his. We quickly became inseparable, and our bond has only grown stronger over the years. We've shared many memories from trouble in our youth, like getting caught drag racing, to standing as best men at each other's weddings. Our wives are best friends too. For our upcoming 11th wedding anniversary, Emily and I wanted something special. We had long dreamed of taking the scenic northern train ride across Canada, a 14-day adventure through scenic landscapes like Banff, Jasper, and the Northern Rockies. A trip I've wanted to take since my college days. David and I are both dentists with thriving practices. We went into partnership, buying and remodeling a building in Portland, Oregon, that allowed us to share common areas while maintaining separate workspaces and private offices. We close our practices down each year for the month of August, taking the whole month off for some really worthwhile vacation time. Then, for the rest of the year, we don't take any time off except for weekends and holidays, and we rotate on call for emergencies on those, so we are pretty well tied to one another. David's wife, Laura, is 55, trim, and a fiery brunette. She has a bright, wonderful personality and works for one of the urologists we know from West Haven, a northern suburb of Portland. She's thin, petite, but full of vigor and fun. She's great-looking and, so far as I know, totally faithful to David. Emily, my wife, is tall and graceful, with an elegant, willowy figure and striking features. She has a radiant presence that captures attention wherever we go. People of all ages notice her, from high school students to older individuals, as well as those in our own age group. She's one of those women who naturally draws admiration due to her beauty. However, her personality is what truly defines her, though many never get the chance to know her beyond her outward appearance. Emily and I met in her freshman year of college. She was training to be a dental hygienist, and I was becoming a dentist. We had some classes together as I was a graduate teaching assistant. I asked her out and we dated off and on for nearly 4 years. We got married in her junior year. We had Jake in her senior year. Emily did finish getting her 4-year degree, but it took an extra year for her to do it. I am 5 years older than her, but I had extra years of schooling plus 2 years of internship, so I got my DDS before she got her 4-year degree. Emily was wild in high school and even during college while we were dating. She admitted to having experienced other guys before we became serious and engaged. We dated off and on before we decided to get married. She knew David long before we got married because David and I were together all the time, so they went back almost as far as she and I did, though ID met her first but introduced them on our 2nd or 3rd date. I never knew for sure if they'd been intimate. Sometimes I kind of suspected that they had been during one of our breakups. Despite the possibility, they remained loyal to me, never changing how they acted toward me, and I really had nothing for proof other than an occasional uneasiness. There was never any hard evidence or real indication, or at least none that I recognized. When David met Laura and fell in love, it seemed there were no more sneaking suspicions, so I never pushed it. We were a foursome and partied heavily together lots of times. Emily is a strange one in bed. When she is menstruating, she becomes sexually ravenous, almost rabid. During a 4 to 5 day part of her cycle, I think she could have sex continually 24/7 in her quest to scratch that itch. During that time of the month, we have almost non-stop sex when I am home. Plain vanilla sex nowhere near meets her needs and desire for sexual fulfillment. She wants it rough and hard, lots of it. However, during the rest of the month, she is bland sexually. She isn't demanding and almost never initiates sex. Also, when I am done, she is done. I asked a gynecologist friend about it once, and he just shrugged and said, "Different women are different. I wouldn't worry about it if everything else is normal. If there's no excessive cramping, bleeding, or other abnormality, let it run its course." So I learned to live with it. I know that once a month, I'll get my socks screwed off for a few days. The rest of the time, I get by with whatever I just have to have and no more. In April, Emily and I decided to take Jake on the scenic northern train ride that summer. It would be the best family vacation we had ever had, and we couldn't wait for August so we could leave. I mentioned to David what we had decided, and he showed great interest in the trip. He asked if I'd mind if he asked Laura and maybe plan the trip so we could all go together. It was great with me, and I said, "We'd love it. Ask her and we'll get you the information so you can book it. You need to book right away though, so don't wait." I told Emily about my conversation with David earlier that day. The strangest look swept across her face. It almost looked like arousal to me. Laura called that night and got the booking information from Emily. They had decided to go with us. In July, before our trip, I was scheduled to be off on a Wednesday afternoon, which is common. David was just scheduling lightly and said he wanted to get out of the office early too. I didn't go golfing like I usually would do, deciding instead to get caught up on some insurance paperwork, sign patient notes, and the like. I stayed in my office with the door closed so I wouldn't be interrupted. At about 4:45 p.m., I hit a bump in my hitherto smooth-sailing paperwork and needed to see David about a regulation we were supposed to be following. I pushed the intercom to his office and said, "David, you still here?" A long silence followed. Yeah. What do you need, Nathan?" "Good. I'll just come over to your office. I need to ask you about this Medicare regulation." I switched off the intercom, stepped out of my office, and walked the 30 feet to his office. I just opened his door and went in. Emily was in there, and they were breathing kind of hard. They were a little disheveled. Her hair was messy, their clothes rumpled. They acted like they'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. "Emily, what are you doing here?" I asked, looking at David, then at her. "Oh, Nathan, I thought you were golfing. I was just telling David about our trip, what we are expecting, that we're so excited. I was just saying that we've been planning this for years and how you'd wanted to do this since college." She blanched. "Yeah." I snorted. "What's up here, guys? My wife and my partner bumping their uglies." I queried, rage building in me. "Nathan, knock it off," David said. "We thought you were golfing and we were talking about the trip. Your birthday comes in August while we'll be on the train, and we were talking about that if you need to know the truth." He appeared relieved at his quickly thought-out excuse, but it was still an excuse. I left the room without saying a word, walking out to where my car was parked in the shade. No wonder she hadn't seen it. I hadn't used my regular parking spot because it was so hot that day. I got in and drove off. My cell rang repeatedly. David's office number, Emily's cell, and finally David's cell. There were probably 30 calls in that first 2 hours. I beat her home, loaded a suitcase, and hot-footed it out, getting a room at the local Vista Lodge. My cell phone rang at intervals all evening up until about midnight. I had it on silent so I'd see the light come on, but I did not answer it. The next morning, I was at the office at 8 a.m. I had a heavy patient load, with appointments stacked one after another. I had been trying to get everyone seen who needed to be seen before being off for a month. David had a heavy load that day too, for the same reason. I checked his appointment book. During the day, several messages came in to reception from Emily for me. I told the receptionist I was too busy to take any calls today, so to tell Emily not to call because I was snowed under. She still persisted, but so did I. The poor receptionist knew the Coopers were feuding, but she didn't know how seriously. I hated my staff to be in the middle of this, but I couldn't do anything about it except talk to Emily, and I was not going to do that right now. I slipped out of the office Thursday night before anyone could catch me and went to my hotel room. Friday morning, I was back at work, still fully loaded with patients, one after another, and there was no let-up. Right around noon, Emily walked into the office, thinking I might have a lull for 15 minutes while I scarfed down a sandwich. There were patients in each of my 3 exam rooms, employees everywhere, plus David's contingent of staff and patients. There was no privacy, and a shouting match was out of the question. Though I considered that choking her to death would be quiet, and I could do it in my office where I could remove her body hours later after everyone had left. I couldn't do that, but I could dream it. I think the patient sitting in the chair at that moment probably got a little too much lidocaine, but she didn't have any pain during her procedure. My reputation for painless dentistry would be intact. Emily stood in the doorway of the exam room as I was working, bent over my patient, concentrating on my work. She stood there, staring at me. My assistant said, "Dr. Cooper, Mrs. Cooper is here." "Oh, hello, dear. I'm snowed under right now, as you can see. Can it wait?" I forced a cheery answer. "Okay, yes. What time will you be home, honey?" she asked, just as forced, just as cheerily. "It's the weekend. Tonight I have patients until late and then some catching up to do on paperwork. It'll be really late, I'm afraid," I intoned. "Don't hold supper." She just said, "Okay. See you later tonight then." She turned around and walked out. She knew that I was steamed from my forced tone and words. Knowing me for 12 years, she knew I'd address her when I was ready. And not before. I left a note on David's desk before I left the office. 9 p.m. tonight. Here. Nathan. When I walked back into the office at 9:10 p.m., I found an agitated but contrite partner and friend. "Damn it, Nathan. I spend enough time in this office. Why tell me 9 p.m. if you weren't going to be here on time?" he started in. "Because, you miserable son of a... I'd have killed you if I'd come in here at 9 p.m. Took me a moment to take control of myself and calm down. As I was remembering catching you two the other day, I just saved your miserable life. So quit your bitching." "Geez, Nathan, cool down. Nothing happened," he said. "If nothing happened, it is only because I interrupted you. I see it, you are out of control. And if you aren't going to talk reasonably, I'm leaving," he threatened. "That's okay with me. I'm putting your butt on notice now. You lay a hand on my wife, and your life will not be any fun anymore." I yelled eyeball to eyeball with my partner. I drove straight from the office to home. When I walked in, Emily was sitting at the table. She had been crying. "Nathan, I'm so glad you're home, honey. I want to talk to you, please," she begged. "Emily, first you will listen, and then you can talk," I said sternly. "I know you two have your stories worked out by now. I know you too well to be fooled by your lies, so you get to make a choice. This may be your last choice as far as this marriage goes, but you do get it. Tell me the truth in full. If I sniff one hint of a ruse or a lie, I will move to end this marriage immediately. If you tell me the truth, no matter how damning it is to you, I will consider everything and decide when I am more in control. I'll wait until we get back from Canada," I said. "That is your choice." Oh, honey. Well, okay. I love you." She began twisting her hands, looking anxiously about her but not at me. It was a long silence as she decided what and how to tell me. I sat expressionless, glaring right at her face while waiting for her to speak. "Nathan, you know how I get just before and during my period. This isn't news to you. I am so excited. I can't help it. Something happens to me. Most of the time I wear you out and can get by. But there have been times through the years when you either weren't available or couldn't quite get me where I needed to be. Sometimes, I went to David." She began trembling, looking at me, unsure if she was doing the right thing in telling me the truth about her and David. "He's always been your best friend. And he's always been such a gentleman to me and so helpful and safe. When we were in college, you were taking exams, cramming all night. You had to do well or you couldn't go on. And the subjects were so tough for you, remember?" I sat mute, listening, not outwardly reacting. My hands were cold. My throat was dry. I wondered if I'd have a stroke. My head was pounding. Well, I needed relief, and David, well, he was always around and safe. I knew I could trust him. And he hadn't met Laura yet, or if he had, they weren't serious yet. He never came on to me. I just called him and asked if I could come to see him when you were in a study group one night. I went to his house, that one that he and those 4 guys rented together off campus. He was waiting for me out front when I pulled up, wondering if something was wrong. "He was concerned for me," she said. I was so excited, Nathan. I couldn't help myself. I saw him and threw myself into his arms, kissing him and grabbing him and rubbing my body. I was beside myself. David took me upstairs, and we had sex. She was crying, sobbing. She looked at me with fearful eyes, wondering how I'd react, what I'd do. She was shaking and sobbing. Have you screwed him since? I asked. Yes, several times through the years. Like I said, I knew he was safe and wouldn't hurt me. When you were out, unavailable. When I couldn't get enough from you. I knew I could call David, and he could help me. He was so large. Can make me calm down sometimes. He can go a long time, which is just what I need. You already know that. She wept. So I'm not enough for you? You are out of control? Need a second man to keep you serviced? Can't use a toy? Is that about right? I asked. Then I continued, not waiting for her answer. The rest of the month, I languish while you do not require your servicing. My needs are secondary to yours. And for years, you felt like it was okay to screw my best friend behind my back for your needs because he is so much bigger than I am, and he's safe and convenient. Do not tell David. Don't tell Laura. And don't tell anyone that you've told me this, Emily. I am going to think about this and I want my options open. If I find out you've betrayed me further with him, protecting him from me, I won't be happy. Understand? Okay, I won't. Please, Nathan, don't leave me. She begged. I love you. This is no weak-willed woman. Emily is a woman of considerable allure, and she knows it. I know that she didn't need to beg me. There'd be dozens of men that could warm the cockles of her heart if she'd wanted that. She did seem to be repentant. Even trapped inside her own body during 5 days per month wasn't necessarily her fault. I do know that her proclivity for uncontrolled sexual lust and need for satisfaction is real. The facts cannot be denied, not even by a totally distraught husband. However, there are toys and some medical remedies if she'd only have sought them. However, my friend, my partner, my brother in all ways except blood was a different story. That is betrayal in the highest sense of the word to me. Is there anyone else? I asked her. No, never. I mean, when we were dating, before we'd, gotten engaged, there were some. But not after we committed, she said. Oh, I'm such a rotten person. Oh, Nathan, what am I going to do? I'm so sorry. She cried remorsefully. You are sleeping in the guest room for now. For starters, I said. I went upstairs to bed. When her 5 days of estrus visited her, I was not going to be available to her. That much I knew. It would hit her a few days after we were on the train in Canada, according to my figuring. I was going to lie in wait for my partner and sink his life like he'd sunk mine. We each took our own cars to Seattle when we left for Toronto. We had so much luggage that it wouldn't all fit in one car, plus all 6 of us. For adults and 2 kids. We had to pack for 3 weeks, even though the train ride was 14 days. We had to spend a night in Toronto and a night in Vancouver, plus it's always good to pack a little extra for emergencies. We got on the train on Friday morning, and off we went, heading for Vancouver via the entire Canadian part of the continent. Emily began to show signs of discomfort after 2 days on the train, and I avoided her deliberately, distancing myself from her and pushing her toward David. She held off for a day and a half, but eventually, she sought him out and spent time with him in our sleeper during the afternoon of our 3rd full day. When I unexpectedly opened the sleeper door, I found them in an intimate moment, both unaware of anything except the rhythmic sound of the train. What on earth? I thought to myself about the time they noticed me standing there. Laura, white as a ghost, came running and crying down the hallway of the sleeper car. Something's wrong with Samantha. I can't get her to respond to me. Please come help her. Nathan, she cried, never even noticing her husband and my wife tangled up in the sleeper unit. I left the door to the sleeper open, exposing them to passers-by, and ran to the lounge car, where the kids were sitting watching the scenery roll by. Samantha was pale, clammy, and semi-conscious. Has she had her insulin, Laura? I asked. Yes, just like normal, she replied, holding up the vial of Humalog to me. It's cloudy, Laura, I said. Look, it's no good. I took the vial and noticed that it was very cloudy and had sediment in the bottom, a sign that it had lost its efficacy. Do you have another vial of Humalog? I asked her. Also, get her blood glucose monitor. Let's check her sugars. The meter read that her sugars were over 470. She was in hyperglycemia, probably ketoacidosis too. The insulin not being any good had not been working. She had been getting sicker and sicker, and nobody had noticed. Laura brought another vial of the insulin, unopened, still in the box, and handed it to me. It's all I have with us. It should be more than enough for 3 weeks, she said. I opened the box. It was no good either. The insulin is cloudy too, I told her. It must have come from the factory that way or was allowed to get too hot or too cold. You have no other insulin than this, Laura? I asked. I brought 2 vials, Nathan. That's 2,000 units. More than enough for 3 weeks under any circumstances, she said with anguish. I'll have to give her some of mine then. But I don't have enough for us both for 10 days to get us to Vancouver, I said. Especially since we need to give her so much to get her back to normal now. Do you think 80 units will be enough for this initial bolus? I asked her. That's a big dose. I've never had to give her that much, Laura worried. She's over 470, Laura. We need to get her sugars down, I said. David and Emily rushed up about that time, looking sheepish as could be. Did you get all the blood cleaned up? I spat at them. David, I am going to save your daughter's life, you cheating scumsucker. Not because of you, but in spite of you, I said, not waiting for their answer. Emily, David, and Laura watched as I pinched Samantha's lower belly and injected my own insulin into her. She was a sick little girl. What are you talking about? Laura asked. Emily and David were standing there in total embarrassment. Our spouses have been lovers for 12 years or more, Laura. I just caught them screwing when you were running up to tell me about Samantha. They were in our sleeper going at it. I told everyone within earshot. Emily started crying, and David withered under Laura's glare. Samantha was still unconscious, unstable, and there was no way of doing more for her at the moment with what I had available. I checked her glucose meter again after 15 minutes. She was slowly descending. It was 410. I took her reading again in 30 minutes. It was 290. Then again 30 minutes later, it was 170. She was conscious again but cranky, scared, weak, and tired. I'm not sure I have enough test strips, Nathan. If we keep testing her every hour, I only brought about 75, Laura worried. In spite of the infidelity of my best friend and my wife, Samantha, my treacherous partner's daughter, was the most important issue at the moment. The most worrisome thing was that I didn't have enough insulin for us both for 10 days. Now the test strips also became an issue. I only had what I needed for my own use, but it was essential that we keep a close watch on and control Samantha's sugar levels. She was brittle at the moment and might continue to be until we could get medical help. Make sure she drinks a lot of water. We'll have to use my test strips when you run out. Let's try to get and keep her stable and see where we're at, I instructed. She is the most critically ill. Being a type 1 diabetic, her body produces no insulin or cannot process what she does make and is totally dependent on external insulin. I am a type 2 diabetic, and while my body produces some insulin, it isn't enough. My weight and sedentary lifestyle were my culprits for sure. I decided that I had to forego full doses to make sure she got enough to get her safely to the end of our trip. I tried to calculate what she'd need. Her mom said she normally took about 50 units a day of the short-acting insulin. With the 80 I already gave her, she'd need almost 600 units of what I had on hand. And I only had about 900 units. I usually take around 70 units per day. I had started the trip with a full vial plus half of another, but I'd taken the partial vial and a little of the new one, then gave Samantha 80 units. That's how I figured I had about 900 units left, and we needed about 1,200 to 1,300 units between us to get us to Vancouver. We were in the middle of the Canadian wilderness, and we had over 9 days of cross-country travel left. I'd have to cut my doses to about half or a little less to make sure she had extra in case she needed it. This was going to be painful. I could end up pretty sick myself here. To make things even more tense, we had only the two sleepers between the two families and nowhere else to go except the dining car or the observation car. It was quite the dilemma, not only for me but also for Emily and David. I stopped talking to David and Emily. I just never said a word directly to them. I talked to the kids and I spoke some to Laura. We went to bed that night, and I could hear and feel Emily pleasing herself next to me, crying and suffering terribly. But I had no sympathy. I had been betrayed, and I knew it had been going on ever since I'd known her. She could have learned to use a toy or get some medical help. Or, hey, how about talk to me? David, my so-called best friend, was even worse to me in my mind. The two of them had carried on behind my back. If there was a time to seek a solution to her problem, she'd had years to present it. Now wasn't the time, and it wasn't with my best friend 12 years earlier either. Now, in the middle of nowhere, stuck together, I was going to ride this into the ground, and then burn it down with it if needed. I'd do my best to pound sand up David's ass. The trouble was, he was probably capable of beating me. I'd never be able to get the better of him with the tactic of surprise because he'd now be on alert, I was sure. So the element of surprise might not be that easy to come by. Emily was miserable, caught in the act after having admitted it to me at home, and in the throes of her condition, if that is what it should be called. She couldn't get me to deal with her. She was afraid to see David alone again. Laura was furious with her. She was adrift and alone with no obvious remedy. Emily found a solution, as always. The conductor. He was a kind, big man in his 60s with his own berth on the train. Emily discovered him there and introduced him to a woman who was experiencing some intense emotional and physical discomfort. I'm not sure the man ever fully recovered from that encounter. I followed her the next night as she left our sleeper, the train rocking everyone to sleep except for her and me. When she exited the car, I quietly left the sleeper as well. I followed her through the next car, entering from the other end. When I couldn't see her, I knew she was somewhere within that car. I checked each compartment until I found her. Upon finding her, I was taken aback, and the conductor, noticing, looked at me in fear. I quickly stepped in, took Emily's hands, and guided her back to our car as she quietly protested. When that old conductor saw the blood on himself in the morning, I am sure he'd freak out. I took Emily back to our room and used my belt to tie her hand and arm to our bed. She'd not leave this bed without me, and I wasn't going to touch her. She'd have to tough this one out. The next morning, there was some sort of mechanical malfunction with one of the diesel train locomotives. They announced that we'd make an unscheduled stop in Dawson Creek for repairs, expecting the wait to be 1 to 2 days at least. We could at least get the insulin crisis averted and Samantha to medical attention. But I also decided on something that would scorch the earth of two families. With the four of us seated together in the dining car, David, Laura, Emily, and me, I laid out an ultimatum. One of two things is going to happen here in Dawson Creek, I said. Either both David and Emily get off here and find their own way back to Portland, or I do. Their eyes widened. Their mouths opened, breathing shallow. Nathan, don't be stupid. There is no need for this, David begged. Oh, honey, please. I'm so sorry. Don't do this, came Emily's reply. Laura never said a word. She just looked at me with a mixture of don't leave me with them and I wish I could go with you. But because of Samantha, unsure travel arrangements might not be wise, and she needed constant monitoring. They could get the supplies they needed in Dawson Creek, go to the clinic, and have a doctor treat her. But getting through the rest of the trip would be tense. I have a DNA sample of Jake, and I'm going to check him for paternity, whether or not I am his father. More than that, my days as part of you and my unwilling triumph of monthly pleasure is ended. I'm through with you both. Our partnership, both of you hear me, our partnership is cancelled from this moment forward. I was yelling as I finished, the veins in my neck sticking out, my fists clenched and white, the lips of my mouth dry and thin. I was in fight or flee mode, and do or die it would be. I had become enraged and out of control with anger, insult, and the deep sense of betrayal. David rose from the table and I swung at him, grazing his chin and knocking him off his feet, but not really hurting him. Emily started to stand, and I cocked my fist at her, ready to smash her face if she stood all the way. She sat back down and avoided a closed fist, but I also avoided sure jail time. David stood back up, out of the range of my swing, but I attacked him with a vengeance, rushing at him and hitting his chest with my fists, missing his face. He was the better man, and he had me on the ground in a heartbeat, holding me down. I could hear Emily crying, and the whole train car was disrupted. 2 or 3 men helped David contain me, telling me, "Calm down, buddy. What's the problem? He's screwing my wife. That's the problem. Let me up, and I'll leave the train." Emily cried, "Oh no, Nathan. Please don't leave, Nathan, please." The 3 men, David included, eased their hold on me. I slowly got off the floor, went to the sleeper with them following me closely, and got a suitcase. I packed my essentials and stepped off the train, walking away without looking back, seething and breathing utterings of hateful vitriol. Neither David nor Emily had ever seen me so livid, so animated, like a vicious, trapped beast. I am sure they realized that I was a very present threat to them both aboard that train. I was able to catch a tour bus to Calgary and then flew into Vancouver and on to Portland direct. I was home in 2 days. They had at least 8 more, maybe 9, with the connecting flight home, depending on how long repairs took in Dawson Creek. I sent the swab from inside Jake's cheek to the lab. I listed my dental practice, including my half of the building and equipment, for sale in a professional journal for dentists. The journal also has a strong presence online, so the available business was instantly listed worldwide to any dentist looking to make the move immediately. I paid all outstanding credit cards, utility bills, mortgage payments on the house, and car payments out of our existing checking account, which nearly depleted it. I took half the savings, half the certificates of deposit, and all my belongings and got ready to move out of our marital home. When they returned, she had a credit card in just her name. I did not cancel that one, but I canceled everything else for which we had joint ownership. I hired a lawyer and had him draw up divorce papers, which were to be served upon her return home. I also had the lawyer prepare a lawsuit against David to dissolve the partnership with breach of trust, paternity, alienation of affection, and whatever the lawyer could find to support my claims against him for sleeping with my wife over the 12 years we'd been together, effectively breaking up our marriage. I spent the 8 days before their arrival back in Portland cleaning up all my messes, accounts, and business. I received the DNA test on the day they were to arrive back in Portland from the trip. Jake was not my son. As hard on the boy as it would be, I was innocent of wrongdoing, and I was done paying the price for Emily's and David's indiscretions. The boy had to be David's if Emily's claim was true that only he and I had bedded her since our engagement. Jake knew David and Samantha. He would be his half-sister. Laura, his stepmother, if she decided to stick it out. He would be fine as any poor scumsucker could be. Like I had said, the partnership ends here. In my mind, the onus of support was out of my life, off my shoulders, and I just needed to finish the sale of the practice, the building, the equipment, and move on. The offices were still shut down for summer vacation, and it was only August 16th, so I had over 2 weeks before patient issues resumed. I had thought of just moving my practice with patients to another location in Portland. However, after weighing the pros and cons, I just wanted away from Emily and David. I never needed to lay my eyes on either one again. Truthfully, I was so humiliated, hurt, and demeaned by David's and Emily's treacherous betrayal that I just had no will to resume life as it had been. I should have been more responsible to my patients. Those were mistakes I made. In my defense, I was overwhelmed with emotional turmoil, and my instinct to escape took over, overshadowing my sense of responsibility to stay and confront the situation. I admit I lacked courage, but I refused to endure their mistreatment any longer. It felt like a matter of survival. Either I would fight back or I would face destruction. I'd been humiliated by becoming aware of Emily screwing David for years. Then again on the train, after she knew how seriously I was taking this. I was humiliated on the train by David in that fight. Facing the train's conductor. Humiliated at every turn. In my mind, I just wanted relief from the pain. The pain of humiliation. The pain of anger. The pain of hatred and bitterness. I was emotionally unstable, I am sure. But I knew that to preserve anything of myself, I needed to extricate myself. I needed to let them work out their own problems with me, no part of any of it. I was in self-preservation mode, animalistic with rage. I was a danger to her, to David, and probably even to myself. Some might prevail on me to help Emily. She has a medical issue, they may say. I reasoned about that back and forth and decided that she'd had it from before she knew me. I knew she'd had gynecological visits several times. It would have to have been a subject. And even if she didn't mention her condition to her doctor, she was dishonest with me from early on, before our marriage. She had options, lots of them, through the years. But I was done helping her. It was now time for my self-preservation. A Chinese lady once said to me when I became angry with someone intruding on my massage, "Why do you hurt yourself with anger over someone else's mistake?" I needed to step back, take stock, and calm down, or I would lose myself in this rage. I got an offer on my practice before we opened back up August 1st. I had finally decided to keep my patients and employees served while I was in secret negotiations to sell. I returned to work, never talking to David or Emily, just staying at my apartment and going to work. The divorce was in the works. David had been served his papers, me suing for the dissolution of the partnership with damages, plus back child support. It would be up to him to prove that he wasn't the father, with Emily's claim that he and I were her only partners during the time of Jake's conception. Nothing more was being dealt with by me other than negotiation of the sale of my practice and regular ongoing patient care. I sold it finally in September. I took less than I could have gotten if I'd have wanted to wait it out, but I did make a small profit. I had to notify the divorce court about my new net worth, including the proceeds of the sale of the business. Fine. I did it. Let the sex continue, I thought. Emily made several attempts to talk to me. I refused every one of them. I had Jake's DNA results inserted into the divorce paper servings, so she knew about that by the first of the year. By the first of the year, I was extricated entirely from the dental practice and the building. The divorce was not final yet, but it was rapidly approaching finality in late January, which would complete the mandatory 6-month minimum. I just gave her half of everything. She didn't ask for alimony, and Jake isn't my child, so there was no child support due. The partnership lawsuit and paternity claims still loomed and probably would take a couple of years to settle. I was going to hurt him as much as I could, so I didn't care how much time it hung over his head. It was worth it to me. I only had a license to practice dentistry in Oregon, so I moved to a small town in eastern Oregon, Pendleton. It's a town of 15,000 folks, about 2 hours northeast, and would suit me just fine. Presented a lot slower lifestyle. I'd have to start up a new practice, go slow, retrain new staff, and acclimate myself to my new home. But I had enough of a nest egg to weather most storms that could come my way for a few years. And I was more than willing to do what I had to do to make this work. Our divorce was finally granted. I never had to talk to Emily, though she wanted to and tried to several times. To this day, I haven't seen David. When we ultimately go to court, I'll have to face him then, but I am more than willing to air my dirty laundry with him in public. So I have no thought or worry there. His attorney did try and settle, but I just told my lawyer, no settlement. I want a judgment. Period. I wanted my day in court to expose his treachery as a friend. How he went into a business partnership with me, knowing that would tie my wife and him together, making their trysts appear innocent and more likely. I was after money, sure, but I wanted his actions to face the light of day. I never talked to Laura again either. I wondered how Samantha was doing so many times, but I didn't want to risk David being around or him tapping the lines, potentially jeopardizing my suit against him. So I let it hang. I'd begun to build good equity in my practice, the building, equipment, and our home. I walked away from it all, disgusted, humiliated, and furious. The issues are still unresolved somewhat, but I am not unhappy now. I am building a new patient load, and I have a few friends from around my neighborhood. I don't date too often, but I do occasionally take a 26-year-old woman out to dinner. She is a patient, and that's how I met her. I did not pursue her. She pursued me. I finally relented, and we went out to eat, to talk. But no sex yet. Maybe someday there will be, but not yet. A bitter divorce, betrayal by your best friend and partner, are traumatic events. Looking back, I know I mishandled some things, but I can't go back. And I won't demean myself to David or Emily. So all I can do is what the old rancher from Pendleton says to do. Move forward, son. Let the dust settle behind you. I'm older now than I've ever been in my whole life. There are just some things you cannot unsee, you know what I mean? Sometimes tragedy, whether it's someone else's or your own, swamps your boat. It overwhelms you mentally after you see it. The big heads call it PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. I've seen a 9-year-old child who had more miles on her than most people at 50. Something about the knowledge of evil in her eyes. Not that she'd done evil, just that she'd met him. We send our 18-year-old children into the belly of the beast, to other cultures, other nations, to stop the spread of war, only to have our children return to us with a 1,000-yard stare, remembering things that no man should have to remember. No longer teenagers, but worn-out veterans. Suffering is everywhere, and it must have always been. There were the lame, the mute, the leprous, the demon-possessed from the pages of history. There are horrendous accounts of suffering from plagues, wars, and dark ages. There is really no end to the documentation of horrid suffering throughout man's history. But the worst suffering of all, in my opinion, is that which one person inflicts on another. For the pain that one person can put on another is almost always coupled with mental anguish, from which there is no escape, no inoculation, and no medication. My name is Nathan Cooper, and I'm a dentist. I was married to a menstrual nymphomaniac for 11 years. We dated for 4 before that. Her name is Emily. I had a best friend since the 3rd grade. He and I were partners in business after having been very best friends most of our lives. His name is David Benson. His wife's name is Laura. My wife, before she became my wife, seduced my best friend David while we were all still in college during one of her manic sexual frenzies. They continued to have sexual liaisons through the years, often up until I caught them almost in the act. I bullied her into admitting her years-long affair with David. And not long afterward, I actually caught them in the act. I divorced her, sued him, and even saved his little girl's life while the worst of it all was going on. Immediately after actually catching them having sex and saving Samantha's life, I risked my own by intentionally shorting my own medication to see that she had sufficient doses to make it safely to medical help. Several days hence, as it turned out, I was further humiliated by David in a fight that I instigated. But Emily had continued to aggravate with her promiscuity. I was left with no way to preserve my dignity, unable to escape the constant torment. I kept my composure and finished my tasks, distancing myself from the 2 families and the son I had raised as my own, though he wasn't biologically mine. It was another source of immense humiliation and heartbreak for me, but I can only imagine the devastation it caused Jake. The mental imbalance that had presented itself to me at the time was powerful, and I barely managed to keep it at bay while I untangled myself from the throes of my marriage to Emily and partnership with David. I restarted my life in a town 2 hours away, replaced my dental practice, even dated a few times. But seething beneath the surface in my mind was a thirst for revenge, and a hunger for inflicting great pain on those who had dealt so treacherously with me. For the first year, I was so wounded that I could not bear the thought of encountering Emily or David. My soul was bleeding so profusely that any slight touch of their hand in my life would have been like the breaking of teeth and then the drinking of vinegar to me. Unthinkable. But as time passed, I was able to stop obsessing about the pain and begin a new and rational thought pattern. That included revenge. Assuming that is rational. The analgesic for emotional pain, revenge. I began to believe in it. I started to mastermind a plot that would exact their piece for mine, which was the price I had paid to live on in this world. I had a patient when I was practicing with David as my partner who was allergic to lidocaine. Highly allergic to it. And we'd had a real episode with him going into anaphylactic shock once. If you have an allergy, when you discover it because of a reaction, you must avoid recurring instances of exposure to the substance. Because death can occur more rapidly when the body is tuned into its allergy after repeated instances. This patient was very toxic with me personally after he'd had the episode in our office, and I'd refused to see him again, just avoiding further complications with him. He did, however, continue to see David from time to time. It was discovered that this patient wasn't allergic to carbocaine, which has a slightly different chemical signature than lidocaine. Anaphylactic shock is what a person goes into when they have an allergic reaction to something that enters their bloodstream. Like how some people are allergic to bee stings and can die from just one. Epinephrine is a common drug that is kept handy in all doctor and dentist offices in case of someone going into shock when a drug is administered in the office. Epinephrine is one of the regular drugs that counteract most allergic reactions. I knew that the only patient David had that ever used carbocaine was this one patient. Lidocaine or one of the other local anesthetics was used on everyone else. That patient normally would schedule an appointment in January for an examination, and any fillings or dental repair would take place at that time. It had been over 5 years since I'd left the practice with David. We'd had a settlement of my lawsuit, and I'd won $500,000 from him. Plus, I'd waged war in open court against him, humiliating him, my ex-wife Emily, and embarrassing him in the local paper and before those in the courtroom. It was but a distant bad memory for the people of my past life. I'd been quiet, and nothing much had been heard from me, nor had I heard from them in those years. I did, however, still have a key to David's office, which nobody would realize. I turned all keys over to the new owner when I sold my practice, and there had been no ripple from me for a long while. I should be safe. David was a man I knew well. He did not tend to details much. He trundled through his life and accepted the path of least resistance almost always. Pretty much like water seeks its own level, David sought his own level, taking the easy way. He'd never think to change locks on his private outside entrance to his office. I was sure. On Christmas night, 5 years after the quiet had resumed in his life, after the lawsuit settlement, when everything should be running smoothly, I entered the dental clinic through David's office door. The key indeed was the same as it had always been. I knew where the epinephrine was kept. My key for the med cabinet still worked, of course. Using a syringe, I sucked half the precious medicine from the vials, pouring it down the drain. I replaced it with clear sterile water, diluting it. The refrigerator housing the anesthetics, carbocaine, lidocaine, novocaine, and others was keyed the same as the regular medicine locker. And I replaced the one vial of carbocaine with lidocaine, labeled as carbocaine, which was deadly to only one known patient. David's patient. The man who had been so nasty to me years earlier, when the administered dose I had given him caused his allergic reaction, was that one. Sure enough, 19 days later, the morning news was about a patient who had died in Dr. David Benson's clinic, of anaphylactic shock, after Dr. Benson administered lidocaine to him. That was something the repeat patient of Dr. Benson should not have suffered, since he was a long-time patient of the dentist, and his allergy would have been well known to the doctor. I was busy in my practice in the days and weeks preceding, during, and following all the events. And I had many witnesses, patients, staff, neighbors, and friends. The following days and weeks brought televised, tearful explanations from David that he had been sure he'd grabbed the carbocaine bottle. The diluted dose of epinephrine wasn't sufficient to overcome the shock. And the coroner's ruling was that the patient had repeated exposure during his lifetime to lidocaine, with this final episode being too much for his system. David lost his license to practice dentistry, but only had a few days in jail after his initial arrest, until he made bail. The courts declared it careless but not criminal. Could have gone either way, but the courts are what they are. I figured the death of the patient was just collateral damage, which is acceptable during warfare, according to my warfare training. It is not desirable, but it is acceptable to the ultimate goal of winning the war. Yep, the ends justify the means. No longer would David Benson be able to follow the path of least resistance. His life would now become one of physical labor to feed his family. I was satisfied with my revenge on David. The revenge on Emily would not be as severe, but it would be rewarding nevertheless. It did have the possibility of becoming severe, I guess. It depended. Emily had moved to Boise, Idaho, after our divorce, taking Jake with her. She was a licensed dental hygienist and was working in a dental clinic there. I had taken my vacation the previous year, rented a van with very darkly tinted windows, and followed Emily for over a week. I learned her daily routines, her risings and her laying downs, her goings and her comings. She was always a woman of patterns. She liked to establish a rigorous lifestyle, but she didn't like too many changes. So what she did one day, she did the next, most probably. She was predictable. Aren't we all, to some extent? She had a boyfriend, not a husband, I found out. He was a salesman for oil and gas drilling equipment, and he traveled all over Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Idaho. He was scheduled to be staying in Billings for a week, calling on customers in the Bakken oil fields. I had a patient from Portland who followed my practice when I moved to Pendleton. She loved my painless dentistry techniques and was loyal to me. She was a prostitute in Portland. She was aghast when I was divorced and had heard rumors of my wife's infidelity. Though this woman sold sex, it was her business. She was sympathetic to me, often comforting me when I saw her for her dental procedures. She never offered sex to me and I never asked. I just kept her smile seductive and her teeth in top condition. For $5,000, Nina agreed not to treat her case of syphilis until she had seduced Emily's boyfriend. I found out she had the disease when she came in for an appointment and asked for antibiotics from me. She had looked online and found her symptoms matched those of someone suffering from syphilis. She had reasoned that since she was a prostitute, it was possible, even likely, that she had it and had not been to a physician. The hooker's name was Nina, and she knew how to drive a man to make a fool of himself. She checked into the same hotel in Billings and bedded the salesman for 3 of the 5 nights that he stayed there. I was sure he had her bug. I was in Billings for some of the festivities, though I never got to witness the copulation itself. I sat in the bar, nursing my Coors Light, watching and listening while she seduced and sold herself to him for additional hundreds of dollars. Syphilis is easily treated in its early stages with 1 shot of penicillin. But left untreated for long periods of time, much more serious things can occur. I didn't really care if Emily and her boyfriend found out they had it or not. Whether they caught it in time or not wasn't my worry. I had exacted my revenge, and I was satisfied. No, I wasn't. With my rage spent, having the anger lift, I was void. It had become my companion, my constant conversationalist when alone. Though it may be a stupid thought, I realized. I'm older now than I've ever been in my life. Of course, I was that, but I felt old. I felt dirty, wicked, evil, and unredeemed. My mind was soiled, my soul unwashed. I was a murderer. I had committed medical high crimes, actually doing harm on purpose, which is against the very oath I took. I will do no harm. But how to come clean? How do I go back and undo what I've done? I'd already paid such a heavy price for life. I was loath to pay more. I was wandering along in the foot-deep snow of downtown Portland. It was mid-December on a Sunday, and the Trailblazers were playing in town. Lost in deep thought, even remorse. The game was in progress, and the streets were quiet except for the homeless. Almost everyone was either at the game or in front of a television. I ran into a street preacher down at Pioneer Square. His name was Henry, just like mine. I introduced myself, and he himself. He was handing out quart thermoses filled with hot tomato soup. He also had a bag full of roast beef sandwiches and gave me one of those. I had been pensive, thinking about the direction of my life, when he handed me a thermos and a sandwich. "God loves you, Nathan," he said. "Not me," I smiled. "But thanks for the food nonetheless." And I began to slog through the deep snow away from him. "Do not elevate your sin above the shed blood of Jesus, brother," the preacher said to me. "He died for filthy sinners just exactly like you and me." "Nah, I'm too far gone for that," I replied. "You don't know what you're talking about because you don't know what I've done." "Doesn't matter that I don't know, man," the preacher said. "Jesus took it all on long before you ever did it and forgave it. Man has been doing terrible things to one another for centuries. He already knew that and dealt with it 2,000 years ago. He said it was finished way back then. And what you need to do is just receive the forgiveness of his sacrifice." "I ain't going to no church, preacher," I spat. "I never mentioned church, sinner," he spat back. "So, who do you think you are?" I asked, eyes ablaze. "Just a messenger. "Just a messenger," he replied, with his palms facing me, fingers spread. "The message is, do not elevate your sin above the shed blood of Jesus." "Yeah, I'll think about it," I said, already in deep thought about his words. "Oh, thanks again for the food," I said as I turned away. "I'll pray for you, Nathan," he said. "I'll pray for you, Nathan," he said. "Father, there goes one of your children. He's lost his way. He's drifting. He's headed for a direct confrontation with you, and he isn't ready. He isn't covered by your own preparations, which you've made for him. Continue to be merciful. Show him the lamp on his path so that his feet can follow the road that you've set for him. In Jesus' name, amen." The rescue Nathan Cooper pressed on the breastbone of the prostrate body of the young woman. 1, 2, 3, for breath. 1, 2, 3, for breath. He repeated the cycle of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that life-restoring action that so few actually know how to do. The 20-year-old woman suddenly threw up straight into the air, just as Nathan was about to put his mouth back on hers to fill her lungs with another breath of life. He quickly rolled her to the side, allowing the vomit to spill out of her mouth, preventing her from aspirating it back into her lungs. She belched again, more vomit erupting from her belly. Then she gasped, inhaling a huge lungful of air. Her blue lips and fingertips began to return to a natural color. Nathan wiped her mouth with his sleeve, preparing to administer another breath if needed. Her eyes fluttered slightly, her chest rising and falling unevenly. He pressed his ear to her body. Her heart was beating, though irregularly. He knew he had probably broken a few ribs, maybe even her sternum, while performing chest compressions. But he also knew that, to actually save her life, a certain amount of pressure had to be applied to force the blood through her heart, pumping oxygen throughout her vascular system and keeping her brain cells alive. Nathan had seen the one-car rollover occur just a quarter mile in front of him as he was returning home to Pendleton after spending the weekend in Portland. When he pulled up to the scene, he saw the young woman lying just off the edge of the road, her car overturned on its roof. The wheels still spinning, steam hissing from broken lines and hoses, fluid spewing onto a hot manifold in the snowy ditch beside the interstate highway. It was cold. It was snowing. The roads were icy and slick. The night was dark. Nathan knew they were somewhere near the Dalles on Interstate 84, heading east. As he jumped out of his car, he dialed 911 while running toward the unconscious woman. Between breaths, while performing CPR, he shouted into his phone, telling the dispatcher his best guess at their location. Then he set his phone down on speaker mode and continued administering life-saving efforts to Sophie Reynolds. "Are there others in or around the car?" the dispatcher asked. Nathan hesitated. He just didn't know and couldn't leave her to check. "Not yet. I don't know. I'll look as soon as I'm sure she isn't going to aspirate on her own vomit," he shouted back. After a minute of her breathing on her own, he left her to look around with only the headlights of his car illuminating the dark, snowy road. There didn't appear to be anyone else inside the car or thrown from the wreckage, but he couldn't be sure. He yelled into his phone, relaying the information to the dispatcher. "I have an ambulance on the way, sir. According to GPS coordinates, you're close to mile marker 84. Does that sound correct?" "Probably. I'm in the eastbound lane," Nathan replied. "I can see the Dallas city lights, wherever that is." Moments later, he heard the wail of sirens in the distance. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the falling snow, heading toward him. Passers-by had begun stopping their vehicles. Nathan directed one man with a flashlight to check for others in the wreckage or nearby in the ditch. The fire trucks arrived first, followed by an ambulance minutes later. They rushed to the girl, taking over where Nathan had left off. She was quickly loaded onto a stretcher and transported to Mid-Columbia Medical Center in the Dalles. The highways were treacherous, and the Oregon State Patrol was already tied up with numerous wrecks across the region. Their entire on-duty force was busy miles away and couldn't respond in time, so they sent a supervisor to investigate the accident. The aftermath Lieutenant Carlos Martinez arrived at the scene, took measurements, noted skid marks, snapped photos, and collected Nathan's statement before releasing him to continue his journey home. But Nathan decided to stop by the hospital first, to check on the girl he had just saved. When he arrived at Mid-Columbia Medical Center, Sophie was still in the emergency room. Her parents and siblings were huddled in the waiting area, anxious and silent. Nathan entered the hospital lobby, shaking the snow off his coat, and approached the front desk. "Excuse me, I'd like to check on the young woman brought in from the crash on I-84. Her father, Daniel Reynolds, overheard and stood up quickly. "I'm Sophie's dad. Are you the one who saved her?" Nathan nodded. Daniel reached out his hand. "Thank you. Thank you so much for saving my little girl." Tears formed in his eyes. Nathan shook his hand firmly. "Nathan Cooper," he said. "Nice to meet you, sir. Is she going to be okay?" "We don't know yet. They're still working on her," Daniel said. "The EMTs told us you saved her life, that she wasn't breathing when you found her." Before Nathan could reply, a doctor in green scrubs approached. "Mr. Reynolds? Are you Sophie's father?" "Yes. How is she?" The doctor sighed, offering a reassuring nod. "She's stable, Mr. Reynolds. It's a good thing she laid in the cold snow. It slowed her internal bleeding. She has a nasty cut on her head, some deep bruising, and 2 cracked ribs, likely from the CPR. But she's awake and responsive now." A wave of relief washed over the family. Nathan quietly stepped back, giving them privacy. "Mr. Cooper," Daniel said, turning back to him, "I'd be honored to keep in touch. We want to thank you properly." Daniel's wife, Margaret, took Nathan's business card, tears streaming down her face. She stepped forward, arms open. "Thank God for you, Mr. Cooper. Thank God you were there." Nathan opened his arms, and Margaret stepped into them, sobbing. Daniel joined in, their 2 younger children watching, wide-eyed. Nathan stood stoic, lost in his own thoughts. He had taken a life with one hand, and now, with the other, he had saved one. Nathan made his way slowly home that night. He slept fitfully, rolling over and over, wrestling with his conscience. For the evil he had committed, against the good he had done. He had saved Sophie Reynolds' life, and countless others over the years. He had always donated dental work to certain patients in need. He did it quietly, without public recognition. Even his bookkeeper and receptionist didn't know. Nathan had spent Thanksgiving and Christmas delivering food, hygiene products, and gifts to families in need. He had given generously to those who had no one else to turn to. Yet he had also taken a life, and he had destroyed another's. His revenge against David and Emily had been meticulously planned and brutally executed. David lost everything, his license, career, and dignity. Emily's life had been tainted forever. The syphilis would be curable, but the truth of her choices would remain etched into her history. Nathan had succeeded in ruining them both. But what had it cost him? His soul? His peace? His humanity? Had he won the war, or had he simply become something worse? A murderer disguised as a healer, a destroyer masquerading as a savior. He was both the executioner and the redeemer. He was both guilty and innocent. He didn't deserve absolution. Yet, in Sophie's eyes, he was a hero. To her family, he was a guardian angel. The people he had saved, the patients he had helped, the lives he had touched. To them, he was a good man. But Nathan knew the truth. He wasn't just a good man. He was a damned one. The recognition by late spring, Sophie had recovered fully. She had spoken to Nathan 4 or 5 times since the accident. She was well loved at her school, and her story of survival spread throughout the community. Then, one day, an unexpected call came. Lieutenant Carlos Martinez from the Oregon State Patrol had put together a recognition event for Nathan Cooper, for his heroic actions that winter night. Sophie had personally requested it. On a warm May afternoon, Nathan arrived at his dental office, only to find the entire parking lot filled with people. The fire department, the hospital staff, the EMTs, and Sophie's entire high school class had gathered outside. 16 state patrol cars, including the chief from Salem, were parked in a wide circle, their lights flashing. The crowd erupted in cheers as Nathan stepped outside. Then, over the loudspeaker from the state patrol chief's car, A voice boomed. Dr. Nathan Cooper, your building is surrounded. Drop what you're doing and come outside to receive recognition for what you've done. A 5-second blast from the patrol sirens followed. The sound was deafening. Nathan stood frozen, his stomach churning. After 3 minutes, he finally emerged. The crowd cheered again. Sophie ran to him, throwing her arms around him. The chief of the state patrol stepped forward, handing Nathan a wooden brass plaque. You saved this young woman's life, Dr. Cooper. Your quick thinking and decisive action make you a hero, and we are proud to recognize you today. Speech! 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 The crowd chanted. Nathan hesitated. Then, with a heavy heart, he pulled a small piece of folded paper from his pocket. He put on his reading glasses and read aloud, My soul hath long dwelt with him that hath peace, but now I am peace. He folded the paper, placed it back into his pocket. He looked Sophie and her parents in the eyes, gave them a quiet nod. Then, without another word, Nathan turned and walked back into his office. Sophie followed him inside. Dr. Cooper, what did that mean? What you just said out there? Nathan sighed. It's from the 120th Psalm, Sophie. It's just something I remind myself of often. A new beginning. Sophie turned 19 that summer. She visited Nathan often, spending lunch breaks at his office. She grew closer to him, asking about his past, his marriage, his friendships. She touched him often, held his hand, hugged him, kissed his cheek. She wrapped her arm around his whenever they walked together. Her parents adored him. They treated him like family. But Sophie had other ideas. She had loved him since the night he saved her life. And one stormy September night, she came to his home. Nathan woke to find her standing in the doorway of his bedroom, watching him. He could barely make out her silhouette, but he could sense her hesitation. Sophie, he murmured. She didn't answer. She just stood there, trembling, waiting for him, for his permission, for his acceptance, for him to decide. Nathan sighed. He moved the covers aside, revealing his nakedness, and whispered, Come here, girl. Sophie let out a small whimper. Then, she crawled into bed with him. She was warm, soft, beautiful. She kissed him, climbed on top of him, and made love to him. It was wild. It was raw. And for the first time in years, Nathan felt alive again. Sophie was young, but she was not a child. She had chosen Nathan, and Nathan chose her back. Months later, they moved away together. Nathan sold his practice, retired early, supported Sophie as she went to college. She became a teacher. They built a quiet life in Montana, far from the ghosts of their pasts. And for the first time in decades, Nathan Cooper felt peace. Not revenge, not rage, just peace. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come from forgiveness. It comes from starting over, and never looking back. Thanks for watching. Did Nathan find true peace or just escape his past? Was his revenge justified, or did he go too far? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.